We're here in Charles Atlas's exhibition called The Mathematics of Consciousness, and that inspired us in the spirit that is Pioneer Works, where we believe art and science live comfortably alongside with some friction between the elbows, to do these conversations about science and mathematics. And so we really appreciate you coming out for our experiment, because we really do this because of the community that comes out. I'm so thrilled with our guests. I want to start out by killing the soul, if you'll permit me. I want to emphasize that you are both scientists. Yes? Oh, Anil, what's this?
Yes.
Well, you know,
What's
as you said, I don't think it's separate from culture, so I think it's not. Yeah, it's not something that should be hived off like that. But yes.
Well, you know, I love that.
And scientists too.
And Joe, are you comfortable with this projectile labeling as the scientist?
Sure.
Sure. So you really, though, are empiricists, and you're interested in an actual biological system. You're neuroscientists, that would be fair to say. And there's a lot of magical language that occurs around consciousness and metaphysical language. And I just want to emphasize that we will be talking from a scientific perspective. Would that be fair to say? We're talking about from a biological basis. Joe, would you say that's fair to say?
Absolutely. I mean, if it's, you know, as a scientist, if it's not something physical that you can ultimately measure, then you can't do it.
And so you are interested in this particular biological system. We're talking about the brain. Anil, you often refer to wetware when you're talking about the brain. And Joe, can you give me a kind of, you know, the 5 or so major lobes, aspects of the brain?
Well, there's the...
Just let's pretend there's a handful.
So we have in the back of the brain, we have the occipital lobe. The parietal lobe sits in front of it, temporal lobe below that, and then the frontal lobe in the front, where it should be. And then there's a medial lobe on the inside, sort of like a hot dog bun. If you pull it apart, on the medial side is the medial part. And
those regions that you just mentioned are usually associated with certain functions, which may or may not be exactly accurate anymore. But if you would just entertain us by saying what the kind of historic mapping was of biology and function for a while.
Well, in the back you had sensory areas like the visual cortex and the auditory cortex, the somatosensory cortex. Beyond that you had motor cortex. And then you also had what was called association cortex, for example, areas that put together different sensory modalities. And the highest one of those would be in the prefrontal cortex.
Now, Anil, you have a little more of a diffuse perspective on this. Would that be fair, that you think that the brain functions aren't localized as precisely as we used to think?
I guess so. I think that's probably a shared view. I mean, the history of neuroscience has kind of oscillated between this view of the brain as kind of just a mass action system. Every part of it is equivalent to a perspective where everything is very localized. You know, like one bit of the brain for politics, one bit of the brain for breakfast, and so on. And that's clearly too far on the other extreme. There is localization, and if you have damage to the visual cortex, that's going to affect your visual experience. But I think it's wrong to associate anything that we as organisms do purely with one part of the brain. So my interest is in, like, what are the principles that might involve many parts of the brain, but also, as the title suggests, the body as well, to give us, you know, the sort of integrated experience of an emotion or a thought or a perception.
Mm-hmm. And Joe, you agree with that it's no longer, the boundaries are no longer as distinct as what once was suggested? Sure.
So, I mean, for example, to make a movement, it's not, your motor cortex doesn't just move, it's got to have some input, and for an emotion, you have to build up a lot of information processing for even a simple perception. You know, for example, we don't come into the world knowing what an apple is. You see this thing we call an apple that requires not only sensory processing, but also some kind of semantic memory that tells you what it is you're looking at.
Now, you say we don't come to the world knowing what an apple is, but we do come to the world knowing what some things are. Is that right?
I think very few. I mean, we can I think even the traditional idea that you are going to, freeze to a snake because it's an innate kind of built-in thing is a little controversial now. I mean,
is it? Is it really controversial now?
Well, nothing is purely innate and nothing is purely learned in a sense. Everything is some combination of genes and experience.
Do you think we come to the world, Anil? Do you agree with that perspective? We come to the world fresh, or do we inherit certain? I mean,
we inherit certain tendencies. I think we inherit predispositions rather than fixed ways of seeing, fixed ways of being. So one thing I was thinking of there was there are things that our brain does in order to interpret the sensory information that we're not aware of our brain doing at all. So if we walk around and we see shadows, and we tend to interpret shadows based on the assumption that light comes from above, because otherwise shadows can be a bit ambiguous. Mm-hmm. And why do we do that? Well, because in the sort of history of visual systems for millions and millions of years, light tends to come only from the sun, it comes from above. So that kind of knowledge of how light and shadow behaves is pretty baked in to our visual systems. But even that can be overcome. There's some work, I think, that shows if you train people long enough with lights coming from underneath, then you can get them to see things in a different way. So that's, I think, a remarkable fact about the brain, that it is more changeable, it is more sort of flexible than many of us think.
Joe, your facial expression, which I am reading from here, looked to me like you were not sure you would say the same thing.
No, I totally agree.
Yeah.
I mean, it's.
So I'm bad at reading facial expressions. I have propopagnasia. Is that what that is? No, that's just not recognizing faces. So in our brains, we have something like 86 billion neurons. I think that there was a certain understanding that counting the number of neurons was not that profitable, but there was this sort of push to count the number of neurons. So basically, we are talking about wetware, right? And we're talking about chemical processes. And we're talking about a biological system. And that is where you lie as neuroscientists. Would you call yourself a physicalist, Joe? Could you define that term for us?
Well, it just means that everything that you're interested in is somehow ultimately related to physical principles. I mean, I'm not necessarily one who thinks we need to go down to physics to explain interesting things.
Is everything, as everybody knows.
But there's a level of explanation that kind of, certainly where we are now in science, that is a reasonable level to try and operate at. I'm not sure that's at the level of atoms and electrons.
So let's say we're only at the level of chemistry and biology. We're not going to go all the way to atoms and electrons. And we say there are 86 billion neurons in the brain, and the brain has these different regions that you're describing. When you hypothesize that maybe something has been inherited biologically because of our experience of the sun and the way the shadows are cast, how is that in a mechanistic way stored in the brain? Is it that the neurons cluster together in a physical way? Is it that certain chemicals are stored? Like, what does that mean, that is already in the brain? What are we talking about at like just a base chemical, biological, mechanistic way?
Well, a lot of things that we think are that you might say, well, how does that happen? Basically, there are a lot of very simple little pieces to how things happen. So, for example, to use a snake again, it may simply be the curvature of this thing on the ground that will trigger you to freeze. It's not like snakeness or anything very complicated. It's just there are kind of trigger features that are easily wired in.
So do we know what they're triggering? Are they triggering like a chemical potential that's already built up? Are they triggering a chemical potential? Like how does that work? Because I can't trigger this stage to be afraid of a snake.
No, but you could trigger a light particle, some pattern of light, like the curvature of a stick on the ground in a certain context. That will go in and trigger you to freeze, because all you need is a simple stimulus. I mean, I do a lot of work on Pavlovian conditioning. A very simple tone paired with a shock will cause a rat or a human or any other mammal to freeze in response to that stimulus. So genetically, you can wire in that kind of simple stimulus response thing.
But I think your question does get at something which is often glossed over, I think, in neuroscience, which is that even underlying the simplest behavior, like a Pavlovian response, actually what's going on, the level, the one neuron firing and another neuron firing is ridiculously complex, right? I mean, the circuits we have 86 billion neurons, and we have 1,000 times more connections, so that if you counted one every second, it's going to take about 3 million years to count all the connections in your brain. So people that have tried to build robots, for instance, it's really tough to get them to do even the simplest things with the flexibility and generality that we do. And that's really the challenge. So where are these things? It's not in a chemical, it's not in one neuron. The knowledge that the brain has that allows us to do things like respond to a snake, it's in the connections. It's in the wiring diagram, the connectome, as it's sometimes called. At least that's what I think, when most people would say that's the key. So
let's say a light signal comes to my brain because I'm seeing the curvature, the slither of a snake, or it's something very specific to the snake, and the light enters my eye, and that triggers some electromagnetic interaction, and it goes into my brain. Is it in my brain searching for some configuration that it can match against, that will recognize what that signal is?
There's a very simple, I think you glossed over some of the details there. So you've got
we're only 4 minutes in, give me a chance.
You've got a light coming into your eye, some pattern of light, that has to be transduced into a neural signal that goes down the optic nerve into the brain, activates areas in the visual thalamus. It's a way station to the cortex. But in the case of something dangerous, it also is going directly to the amygdala, which will trigger the response. At the same time, it will go through the visual cortex and get to the amygdala and more slowly trigger the response as well.
How does the amygdala know that that's a response that should be triggered?
Well, that's where the innate tendency comes in. It's not necessarily, a God-given fact, so to speak, but a predisposition that under certain circumstances, that stimulus, especially the second time around, will So
amygdalas that were triggered by that stimulus survive.
Yes. So you're walking, and you find yourself freezing in front of a snake. If you had not frozen and stepped on it, you might die. So there's a little bit of a kind of evolutionary protection that is built in, but it doesn't always work like that because your brain might misrepresent the snake or the curvature. And certainly if it's a stick rather than a snake, it's okay to have frozen. But, you don't want to make the mistake of doing it. People have sent me all kinds of pictures of sticks that they've frozen to on walks in the woods.
That must be a fun inbox. So we are here to talk about consciousness. And so I wanted to ask you, Anil, just if you could just state to me, as briefly as you can, what you believe consciousness is.
Well, that's a tough question. I mean, I think, and I'm aware of some philosophers in the
As
audience.
I said, give me a chance. I'm 4 minutes in.
Yeah,
we're not 6 minutes in.
But I think it's actually quite simple to come up with a definition of consciousness that most of us can get on board with. It won't be the last word, because in science, definitions evolve as we understand more about a phenomenon. But there's a definition I quite like from a philosopher called Thomas Nagel, who said, for a conscious organism, there is something it is like to be that organism. And he means that, I think, in the sense that it feels like something to be me, or to be you, or to be any of you. There's subjective experience going on. It doesn't feel like anything to be this stool, or this book, or that TV monitor. There's nothing it is like to be that system. And I quite like this definition because of what it isn't. So it says consciousness is not the same thing as intelligence. It's not the same thing as having complicated thoughts. It's not the same thing as having this rich sense of self that we have, of personal identity. It's just the raw fact that experiencing is going on for a system. And
Joe, what would your definition of consciousness be?
Well, I think it's a big word, right? And I don't like to talk about it as a thing. There are different ways you can break that down into different sort of levels, I guess you could say. I mean, the psychologist Endel Tulving has a partition that I like quite a lot. He talks about autonoetic consciousness being your awareness of yourself as the entity having the experience, and noetic consciousness being more the knowledge that there is something there, but not necessarily that it's you that's having that experience. And then anoetic consciousness, which is a bit mysterious because it's supposed to be based on unconscious learning, but at the same time still conscious. Now, I think the secret of here is that, the assumption is that the unconscious is a unified thing as well. Consciousness is a thing, the unconscious is a thing, but I think that's a mistake too, that there are different degrees or levels of unconsciousness, so that some things hover on the fringe of consciousness, to use William James's term, that are kind of at the intersection of what's conscious and not conscious. And I think that's the feeling that Neil is talking about, that it's like something. It's that deep understanding of who you are because you've lived all your life. To use a term that's sort of popular now, deep learning. The brain is a deep learning machine, and it feels like you to be something because your brain has lived with all of your knowledge all of your life. So everything about you is somehow deeply learned, and that's what it feels right. The problem is when something doesn't feel right, that's when you are alerted to something is wrong, and then you have to move up to one of those higher levels to explain it.
So it seems as though when people talk about consciousness, that there are as many theories as there is data.
As scientists, or as theorists.
As theorists, okay, that's even better. Mine was very hyperbolic. Yours is only a little bit hyperbole. So there are as many theories of consciousness as there are theorists. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, so this guy, Bob Zients, who was an emotion psychologist, said that about emotion theory. He said that there are as many theories of emotion as there are theorists, and maybe even more, because many theorists have multiple theories.
But I think there's probably it's probably not quite so desperate a situation for us, I think, now, right? I mean, there are lots of different theories, but the one problem is that they're often theories of slightly different things, and I think the suggestion's already there. And what do we mean by consciousness? Different people can mean different things, and then they'll come up with a theory that explains something a bit different. But what's exciting to me is that there are now at least a few fairly well articulated theories that try and explain things about consciousness, maybe different things, and that actually make predictions that can be tested. And I think this is, compared to 20 or 30 years ago, this is a new development, and so there is a number of projects that are designing experiments specifically to test different theories to see which one wins and which one loses, to put it very bluntly. I think it won't quite work like that. But it is moving, and that interaction between theory and experiment, like if you can get that going in a kind of virtuous circle, that's when progress really happens in science.
So we're not debating the existence of consciousness.
I hope not.
I think
some people would, though.
And Neil, you're the only one here.
Well, that makes it easy.
I think, therefore I am. We all have the first-hand. Like you don't like that one? No, tell me.
Well, I mean, poor Descartes. He gets such a bashing whenever, but
he does really well with the whole triangle thing and the Cartesian theorem.
That's fine. He can have, but then you get non-Euclidean stuff. Anyway, we're not here to talk about that. But he does come in for a bit of a beating whenever consciousness comes up these days. I think a little bit unfairly. But his cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, to me is wrong in so many ways, because it's this association of self, I, with thinking, with thought, with rationality, and Descartes.
With being intellectual or being.
Well, just not necessarily intellectual among humans, but he was really trying to separate humans from other animals, and this may have been partly because of the religious pressures he was under, but saying I think, therefore I am, associated self and consciousness with thought, restricted it, removed it from non-human animals, and I think gets the nature of consciousness to me all wrong. You know, you could say, I feel, therefore I am, or my favorite theory of consciousness, I predict, therefore I am. And there are many things that I think are much more fundamental to self than thinking. Thinking is optional.
That's beautiful. Joe, what's your take on his famous saying, Descartes' famous saying?
Well, you know, I'm just finishing up a new book, and I kind of trash the self and say that it's it's really a useless concept because it's so overused and not well defined. The one aspect of self that I kind of allow is the idea of a narrative self, that some understanding of who we are. Now, you're going to say, well, what about all these lower level things?
I am.
Yeah. And, the question is, do we need self? Is there anything besides me that the self is, besides me?
Let's talk about the self. So actually, just a second before we get into the self. You've talked about, both of you, about, let's stick with consciousness for one more second, about how there are hallucinations and perceptions. And I think, Anil, you were getting to the fact that I think, therefore I am is too, why not just like I smell meat and therefore I am? Or, I see a bird.
That wasn't my specific suggestion. No.
Are you a vegetarian?
Can try that. That could be your theory.
I'm a vegetarian for the purposes of this conversation. So, Joe, tell me a little bit about where perception falls in consciousness before we go all the way to the self. Where does perception fall for you in consciousness? Is it literal perception? Do I see the world and know the world? Is it a one-to-one correspondence between an external reality and my internal?
Well, no, I think probably we're on a similar page here, that to me, all of our emotions, memories, perceptions are kind of simulations of the world rather than factual representations.
Neil?
Yes, I think I think we do a line here. So, and it gets back to what you were saying earlier about like how to, what happens when we see something, perceive anything. And so the idea that I've been working with, and it's not a new idea, it goes back to Kant in philosophy, to Helmholtz in psychology, is that we do not see things as they are. It might seem as though we just, the world just pours itself directly into our minds through the senses. But I think what's going on is quite the opposite, that the brain is always making predictions about what's out there and using sensory information to update these predictions. So I've used the term controlled hallucination, so perceptual experience, the world as it appears to us, is a kind of hallucination in the sense that it's internally generated, but it's controlled, it's reined in by the world, but not in ways that are constrained by accuracy. Like evolution didn't design the visual system to see the world as it is. It's not even clear what that would mean, right, to see the world as it is. What would that mean?
Now, everybody is mostly empty space, and we certainly don't see the world as it is.
And also, everybody has wearing different colours of clothing and colours. They don't exist objectively out there in a mind-independent way. So the brain is constructing experience. Even though it doesn't seem like it, it seems as though the world is out there and we just perceive it, but actually we are generating the brain's most useful model, which is not the most accurate. It's what's helped us survive. And that's what we experience, this kind of prediction or collection of predictions.
And you've said that experience is essentially a hallucination. And no?
Well, I just want to be clear, because it's not, that word is tricky, right? Because it could be said...
Experience or hallucination?
Well, both. But hallucination, just because it could be taken to mean that it doesn't really exist. And I'm not saying that. It's experience exists, and it's
you believe
tightly
in a subjective
related.
An objective external
Absolutely,
reality.
yeah. I believe that a real world is out there. Quite what it is, ask you. You're the physicist. You tell me.
I might be a figment of your imagination. I don't know.
You might be, but the way we experience it is always a construction.
And you had this, I'm going to butcher the quote, but you said something to the effect that when other people experience the same hallucination, we call that reality?
Yeah, that was a quote from the TED Talk. That's true. You have to come up with these snappy things.
Are you still living that down?
But I say I think there's a certain truth, because I think that we all experience the world in slightly different ways. I mean, we all differ on the outside, in skin color and height and shape and so on. We all have different brains, so it's very likely we all experience even the same shared objective reality in slightly different ways. But most of the time, we don't really notice, because A, it seems to us we see the world as it really is, and secondly, the differences aren't so big that they surface into our behavior or our language. So we just reach this consensus that, yeah, that car really is red, or that thing really is red. And there is objective reality, but we sort of labor under the assumption that our experience is exactly what's out there because we describe it the same way. So yes, when we agree about our hallucinations, that's what we tend to call reality.
Mm-hmm. And Joe, you are also a believer in an objective external reality?
Yes, I am.
And given that each one of us processes the data slightly differently, how do you think our overlap is? How accurate do you imagine? I mean, I'm not asking for a number, but how accurate do you think the overlap is? We have some few hundred people here in our perception of an external reality, and it's manifesting in our consciousness. What do you think that overlap is?
I don't think it matters, because it's a shared cultural understanding. So, for example, take emotions. I'm of the position that emotions are constructions, that they are cognitive interpretations of situations. So my fear is different from your fear, because I know I have different kinds of, quote, schema that I've acquired over the course of my life about danger and fear, and how I'd like to be in danger, or how other people are, and what it means, and all of that. So that in a situation where your brain sort of begins to pattern complete this kind of dangerous...
And this is the predictive aspect that
it's a prediction based on what's happened in your life. So, you can translate the word fear all the way around the world, because the English language is dominated, so every culture translates their version of what happens in danger into fear. But that tends to lead to the assumption that we all have the same experience because we have the same word. But in fact, every culture has quite different emotional experiences because things are different, have different importance, different value in different cultures.
So, I mean, I'm totally on board with that and the idea of emotion being this construction. In fact, I think I've been very inspired by your work on that and my own thinking about emotion. But I don't agree that it doesn't matter. I think it's hugely important, right, to understand more about these differences. And it's almost as if you planted a question there, because one of my new studies is this thing called the perception census.
I knew that, yeah.
You knew that. I know you knew that. Which is actually trying to measure it. So we don't know very much about...
It was just a flip comment.
No, but it's I think it's one of those things. It's very easy, as you said, it's very easy to assume, because we use the same words, that we have the same experiences. But it's very unlikely that we do. But we don't really know much about the extent to which the few hundred people here have different experiences. At the fringes, it becomes obvious. Like if people are totally hallucinating and believe that Dan Dennett is looming up behind us now to tell us that consciousness doesn't exist at all, then that's a very different reality. But for most of us, it won't be that different. And so, yeah, we have a project. We're trying to measure, actually map out these differences as they manifest on the inside compared to the outside.
As a non-expert in this topic, it strikes me as really eye-opening to consider the concept of prediction being really important in your conscious experience, that you're matching external stimuli to a prediction. And Joe, what you also said about this idea of people having different contexts in which they're interpreting reality, that if we had just a modicum of a global understanding of just human consciousness, we might be approaching a lot of our real life situations differently, a lot of our political situations differently, a lot of our cultural problems differently, if we had that scientific understanding as more, more ubiquitous than it is right
Yeah, I
now.
mean, imagine, so at the UN, things are translated, but the translations don't get the gist of what's meant. And so while it may seem that there's disagreement or agreement, it's really, you can't just rely on the words. You have to have understanding of what the words mean.
And what greater sympathy and empathy we could have just by knowing that. So Joe, now I want to go back to where you started to go earlier, which is about the self. Tell me where the self plays into this conversation about consciousness.
Well, I think it's obviously very complicated. It's a centuries, millennial-old concept. And I think with all of these very old concepts, they come with a lot of baggage. And so I'm trying to peel away the baggage and say, what is the core of the self, at least in terms of the conscious self? What do we know about ourself? And if you want to, extend that to other things, well, let's ask, what is the importance of the body? But rather than put it all under this kind of garbage can concept of the self, which has so many broad implications, I think we need to trim up the language, or focus the language a bit in science. We have a lot of words that have baggage. Fear has a lot of baggage with it, and when you apply
the self
that,
has a lot of baggage.
yeah, when you apply, for example, the word fear to a brain area because you respond to danger, you're adding something that you're adding much more than what's there. In biology, for example, there's a gene called hedgehog. Nobody believes that has anything to do with the real life thing, hedgehog. But if you call something fear, everybody thinks that you're talking about not behavior and physiology, which is what most of the research is about, but about the experience of fear. So brain areas and behaviors acquire all of the baggage of fear when you do that, and that results in a lot of confusion, a lot of failed drug studies about trying to find treatments by studying freezing or avoidance in animals, when in fact the problem is more of a mental problem.
And where does the self fall into this larger picture for you in terms of consciousness?
So for me, I think one of the key things I've come to think is again, it might seem as though this self, the experience of being who we are, is this thing that does the perceiving. That I'm perceiving the world, and it's the me, the I, that's receiving all these perceptions, figuring out what to do, making a decision, causing some action. But the self, and again, all of these things go way back, and David Hume said this in his own words in philosophy hundreds of years ago. The self is not the thing that does the perceiving. The self is itself a perception. So it's in my perspective, it's another kind of controlled hallucination. The brain is, in this case though, rather than making predictions about what's out there, what's the cause of the light that's hitting the eyes, it's making predictions that are more fundamentally rooted and grounded in the body. And this can be the body as an object in the world, this hand is part of my body, that hand is not, this book is not. But it can also be about the body from the inside. And if you think about what brains are for evolutionarily, you can make the argument they're fundamentally about keeping the body alive. They're not to do with poetry or neuroscience or even really moving. They're fundamentally about keeping the body alive. But the brain also has no direct access to the interior of the body. It has to perceive it, has to make predictions. And for me, that's where the real base level of the self is. When you strip away all the frippery, my memories, my plans for the future, my first-person perspective, my sense of agency and free will, the body, what are you left with? I think you're left with the brain basically perceiving and keeping the body alive. And I think that is the core of any self, this simple, formless, shapeless experience of being a living organism.
See, I think that to call that self brings in all the baggage of the self with it. So it's just a personal...
So what would you... So you just think don't... Don't use...
I mean, I like what you said at first, that the self is it's a kind of... You didn't say it, but I think what you were implying is a kind of narration of the body state.
No, I don't think it has to be a sort of narrative. I think that's a higher level.
It doesn't have to be an explicit narration, but it's a story that you are acquiring, even if it's subtle and not explicit, but it is a story you have about who you are.
I think it's much more fundamental than that. I don't think it needs to be a story. It doesn't have to be necessarily extended over time. I mean, there's sort of many ways where you can think about what would be, you know, the minimal level of any experience. Could you, is it possible to have an experience without any element of self in at all? There are people that talk about pure states of awareness. That is just you're not aware of anything. It's just a field of awareness, maybe achievable in states of very, very deep meditation. I'm sort of less sure that anything can be experienced in the absence of a self at this very, very minimal level. And I'm going to keep clinging to that word because I think it's still useful. It still picks out the importance of the body, the importance of the subject in all experience.
So I would put it as, in terms of Tulving's anoetic states, that all of that information about the body is being encoded in subcortical body sensing areas, for example, that Damasio talks about and so forth. And then these are re-represented in medial prefrontal cortex in a kind of fringe consciousness way that allows you to know that everything is working properly in your body. And then you can re-represent that in more complex cortical areas as a thought about all of that. So, you know, I think we're really saying the same thing, but I don't like the label.
We could do the whole rest of the conversation on this, but we're going to play a little game. Okay, I'm going to ask Anil and Joe over these next few images. First, I'm going to ask alive, then I'm going to ask self-aware, and then I'm going to ask conscious. Okay? Okay, it's a little fun game. Okay, these are Roombas. Anil, alive.
No.
Joe, alive.
Alive, no.
No. Self-aware.
No.
Do they have a schema of self?
Maybe.
Maybe. Joe.
No, no.
No. Conscious.
No.
Joe.
Absolutely not.
Okay. The internet, alive.
No.
Alive.
Nope.
Schema of self.
Who knows?
Schema of self.
I'll go with who knows.
Self-aware.
No.
Ooh, dramatic pause.
No. Dramatic pause and a firm no.
No.
Joe.
No.
Conscious.
Nope.
Not according to me, but according to some theories, it would be.
Okay. I sort of am pretty sure the internet's talking to me. Paramecium. Alive.
Yes. Why do I
Alive.
always have to go first?
Of course.
It's not fair.
Good. Joe, you first.
Alive. Yes.
Anil.
Yes, alive.
Schema of self.
No.
Schema of self.
No.
Self-aware.
No.
Self-aware.
No.
Conscious.
Nope.
No. Okay. I skipped you, Anil. Okay.
Oh. Fair enough.
My
We'll
dog.
Never know.
Joe.
Depends on what you mean by consciousness.
Joe, is my dog alive?
Yes.
Alive.
Yes.
Schema of self.
Nah, maybe.
Schema of self.
At some
Is
level.
self-aware.
Yeah.
Can you distinguish those two for me, self-aware and schema of self, Joe?
I can't. Maybe you can.
So I would say self-aware is when you're conscious of being a self,
So
right?
like self as object is
So
schema of self.
so
Self-aware is self as subject.
So schema of self could be, for me, when the brain sort of has a model of what it is compared to what
Right.
it isn't.
He doesn't have that, trust
self-aware
me.
is like, he probably does, but self-aware is knowing that you have that.
Okay.
And so I would say yes, schema of self, no self-aware for the dog.
This is going to be
I'll go
Dogs
with-
can't
I'll go with
recognize
that.
themselves in the mirror.
Yes, they do not recognize
They do
themselves
not.
in the mirror. But as has also been pointed out, that could be because they don't like eye contact, because it's not their strongest
This is true.
sensory experience. That doesn't mean that they can't recognize themselves.
People have been designing olfactory mirrors for dogs. I
I've
still
heard
don't quite
that.
know what that means, but
yeah,
it's
well, that guy smells everything on the Upper West Side. Joe,
What?
conscious.
In its own way, yes.
His own way,
Its
please.
own way.
And Neil,
yes, conscious.
fascinating. Okay, why are dogs always talked about and not cats? Cats,
Live, yes.
alive.
Alive?
Schema of self?
Yes.
Schema
Yep.
of self? Self-aware.
No.
Self-aware.
Depends on what you mean.
that cat's going to kill that cat.
Yeah.
So conscious, we're going to go for a no. If you're no in the...
Of course, conscious, yes.
Conscious.
I think
Conscious
same
is
as
a
dog.
yes.
Cat, dog, same thing.
Conscious in its own way, yes.
Bonobos. Alive. I'm going to skip that part.
Yeah, good.
Schema of self. Self-aware.
Probably.
Yeah, I think so.
And conscious?
Yes.
Probably, yeah.
Anil, you talked very interestingly about a feeling you have when you're with certain animals. They feel conscious to you.
Yeah.
And that you have a hauntingly chilling feeling when you're with a Geminoid or a robot or so where they don't feel conscious. Like you can feel something almost intuitively with a creature that you believe to be conscious.
Yeah, it's hard to know what to do with these kinds of intuitions, right? Because I think we often get misled by them. I mean, we as humans, we tend to be very anthropomorphic. Like we sort of think of things, you know, we project human tendencies onto other things, and we're anthropocentric too. We see other things through the lens of being humans. And so I think it's been a great mistake in the history of biology and thinking to sort of see the rest of nature this way. Yet at the same time, it's really hard to resist it. So it's just when I spent a week with octopuses a few years ago.
We're going to come back to the octopuses,
and they really
which is the correct plural, by the way.
It is, unfortunately. And my memory of that was like this very, very compelling intuition that there was a conscious mind, but a very different kind of mind there. But what was challenging for me was what to make of that intuition, because they're very different brains. They're common ancestor 600 million years ago. But when it comes to sort of these weird humanoid robots that are a little bit clunky, there's a tendency, there's this thing in robotics called the uncanny valley, when things are similar, but not sufficiently similar that we kind of recoil from them. There's something uncanny about them. But what I worry, one of the things, it's a little sidebar, but one of the things I worry about in the future is that we see with AI now, and this sort of drive to build conscious machines and things like that, which I think is way out there if at all possible, but we'll get things that are very, very good at giving us the almost impenetrable illusion that they are conscious by being sufficiently similar. I think that's going to be really, really challenging for us, because it's just playing on our inbuilt human tendency to project consciousness into things that cross a certain threshold of similarity, and that's going to be pretty disruptive for society. We're almost there in the virtual world already.
I do want to talk about AI a little more in a minute, but I think we're all going to agree that human beings are alive.
Yes.
They have a schema of self.
Yes.
They're self-aware.
Some of them.
And they're conscious. Would that be fair, Joe?
Sure.
So I want to come back to AI in a second, but I wanted to dig into this idea that we have, when we're receiving stimuli from the world, that we're matching it against a prediction, because that leads to a lot of, that's evidenced in things like optical illusions. And so I wanted to look at this particular optical illusion. So this is a concave face. Joe, can you tell me about this, or Anil, either of you, whoever wants to jump on it?
I think it's more up his alley.
Yeah, this is a bit like
it's
this.
It's a concave face that's rotating in one direction. Tell me what's going on.
That's right.
Here.
So it's a little bit like that light from above thing that our brain has built in. Now, faces for human beings are super important things in the world. We're social creatures. It really matters to be able to recognize and identify faces. And faces in nature, over the whole history of faces, have always pointed outwards. They've been concave, right? So the brain that's its model of a face, something that points outwards. So when we have a weird situation like this rotating hollow mask.
So it's a concave mask that's rotating, but we cannot see it as concave.
Yeah, that's the thing. Even though we know it is, our brain is sufficiently determined to see faces as always pointing outwards that it creates this really strange situation where we see it rotating in both directions at once at the moment of transition. And so that's showing that there's a really powerful influence of the brain's expectations about the way the world is that drives deeply down, not just into how we interpret what's going on, but how we actually experience it. And it's really, if you can buy hollow masks from shops that sell masks. And if you try it in the real world, it works too with a real hollow mask. But the weird thing is, if you try it, then and it's in the flipped state where you perceive it as pointing out when it's actually pointing in, the eyes follow you around. It's quite weird.
Now, Joe, do you believe that this prediction that's being used to match against the experience in order to make an interpretation, do you believe that that is genetically innate or learned? Or do you feel that the jury is out?
I think predictions are learned.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
you think that they're learned?
I think, it's a spectrum, isn't it? I think, as what we were saying earlier, we inherit predispositions and tendencies, and some of them are more deeply baked in than others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Joe, you've done these experiments called split brain experiments. Can you tell us about that, which also speak to how the brain interprets stimuli?
Sure. I mean, that's how I got involved in the consciousness business. I was a graduate student in the 1970s studying split brain patients. These are people in whom the two hemispheres have been separated in the way that, in other words, the connections between the two hemispheres are sectioned to control really dramatic epilepsy that can't be controlled any other way. Or back then, the medications were not very good. So these people have, for the most part, are able to speak and understand language in their left hemisphere, and their right hemisphere, lacking language, can respond to the world but can't really talk about it. So the interesting thing is when you put a stimulus in the right hemisphere and make the right hemisphere perform a behavior, and then ask the left hemisphere, why did you do that? Without batting an eye, without missing a beat, it has an explanation. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if you've made the person stand up by giving information to the right hemisphere, you say, why'd you do that?
Like, what's the information you would give to the right hemisphere?
Well, this experiment in particular involved a person who could read in both hemispheres, but could only talk with the left. So we had the advantage of being able to say, stand up.
With a text sign.
With a stimulus presented to the left side of space goes to the right hemisphere.
It says the command stand up.
Stand up.
To the left side of the brain.
Right.
So they stand up.
To the right side of the brain.
Or to the right side of the brain. So they stand up.
Stands up and you say, why'd you do that? I said, I needed to stretch. Or if it was laugh, said, you guys are funny.
And the command was laugh. They would laugh, and then they would make up a reason.
The left hemisphere would make up a reason. So, that night at the bar, Mike Kasanik and I, my mentor, were talking about this, and we said, well, maybe this is something we all do. Our brain has all these non-conscious systems that can control our behavior, and it's very disturbing to an entity that thinks it has free will for its brain to be generating behaviors that it didn't control. Mm-hmm. So we said, well, maybe that's an important function of the human brain, is to be able to spin these narratives to make sense of our lives, and that maybe emotion systems might be systems that require these dissonance-reducing narratives. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I turned to rats studying behaviors like responding to danger, because I thought that would give us clues to the unconscious systems in the human brain that might need these narratives.
Did you have a response to that?
No, I mean, I just think the split brain stuff that came out from that time is just a sort of real landmark in the field. And it does get back to this idea of self, though, because of course it's been, it's one of the issues it raises is, can you divide the self? Are there two separate selves, or is the self necessarily unified? And I think that's one of the things that can be challenged, right? We have the impression that the self is inevitably a unified thing, and it really might not be. It might just come together in particular ways in ours most of the time, but not necessarily so all the time.
We had one patient, and I think this is probably the only one in which you could probably say that there's kind of two entities that are conscious of who they are. So because we could put words into the right hemisphere, we asked him, who are you? And the left hand, responding on the basis of the right hemisphere, spelled his name, Paul, with Scrabble letters. And when we asked him, what he wanted to be when he grew up, I forget exactly how we put all that into the right hemisphere, but we probably said something ambiguous like, what do you want? And to be when you grow up was flashed to the right hemisphere. So the left hand spells race car driver. Took a lot of left hand movements to do that with Scrabble letters. But the left hemisphere, when you talk to the guy, wants to be an architect. So here you have a sense of self, of who you are with a name, and a future ambition. Those are two qualities of human consciousness. And so, I think in this patient you have some evidence for two entities that aren't integrated.
Neither of them wanted to be a neuroscientist, though. I noticed that.
No.
I wanted, Joe, to go back to this idea of fear and emotion, which you were talking about earlier. And I know you've spent a lot of time on the amygdala. Can you tell everybody the name of your band?
The amygdaloids.
Can you tell us about the amygdala and why it's fascinating to you in terms of fear and anxiety?
Well, I didn't go looking for the amygdala. When you work on split brain patients, you really begin to think of the brain as a kind of wiring system. It's a system of wires, because you cut the connections between the two sides and all of a sudden information doesn't flow. So, when I started doing this rat work, I said, well, what I'm going to do is take this so-called Pavlovian fear conditioning paradigm, where you pair a tone with a shock and give the tone, very simple. Every rat then freezes, no matter, with one tone shock pairing, the rat will freeze. So it's a very useful kind of procedure to elicit a behavior. And so I said, well, okay, I'm going to start at the ear and trace the connections all the way through the system. That had been done in invertebrates, but it hadn't really been done in complex animals, because invertebrates had fewer neurons, they're easy to work with. But in very few years, because of new techniques that had come along for track tracing of connections in the rat brain, we were able to map out the entire circuit, because the stimulus took us from the ear to the auditory thalamus, which is known to go to the auditory cortex, but it also goes directly to the amygdala, which we found from these tracing studies, which wasn't known before.
And it's like this big.
It's like
Some are bigger than others.
Here's where it is. You shoot an arrow into your two ears and into your two eyes, and where the arrows meet would be where the amygdala is on both sides.
And ends.
Yeah. So, but it's a little thing. It's usually called an almond-shaped structure, but it's only one part of the amygdala that is almond-shaped, and amygdala is the word for almond, the Greek word for almond. So anyway, so the stimulus goes to the amygdala, and then it goes out to the body. So it's a very rapid, in-out kind of circuit, and we trace this whole thing in a few years in rats. And researchers studying humans were able to use fMRI and other kinds of imaging techniques to show that the amygdala in the human brain works the same way, detecting and responding to danger. But the amygdala had become this fear center, this where fear lives in the brain, essentially. And that's what really bugged me, because I never really believed that. But my name got associated with the whole fear center thing. So I went on this tear about 12 years ago, starting these rants about fear, and it's not fear, it's detecting and responding to danger. Fear is the cognitive interpretation of a situation that you find yourself.
Mm-hmm. Why is it, Anil, do you think that we study negative emotions more than positive emotions? And isn't that scientifically true?
It probably is. I don't know, maybe it's probably just easier to, I guess, and this is not something I know, but if you're working with animals, it's easier to recognize, or at least to describe, come up with some criteria.
You can't tell when a rat's in love?
You can't even tell, the rat, they don't smile. You can't even tell when a rat is kind of relaxed, maybe. Maybe you can. Actually, my first job in science was rat handling. It was making rats feel comfortable being picked up by humans, lulling them into a terrible false sense of security, as it turned out. And so I did get a sense of like, okay, yeah, this is a relaxed rat now. So you could tell that. But then then they started doing this scary stuff.
The thing is, responding to danger has to happen. Whether you respond to a sexual partner or food or anything else can always be put off, right? But danger is immediate. And so it's just a fundamental thing. And negative is much more powerful than positive.
You talk about negative emotions as monopolizing the brain and also being socially contagious. And that leads me to ask another question, which is that you both often talk about consciousness as individual, the self, the individual perception. Yet you acknowledge that it's wetware, which is specifically human. You acknowledge that there are specifically human dimensions of the brain. Isn't it specifically human to be social? Like, we don't think if we raise somebody in a closet without social stimuli that would have a normal consciousness.
Well, other animals are social. I mean,
yeah, and
primates.
Yeah, I mean,
humans. So why are the conversations about consciousness not heavily reliant on the social network?
Oh, they are. I mean, Chris Frith, really good colleague of ours in the UK, and his wife Uta Frith have this book coming out now on the social basis of consciousness. You know. So there is stuff out there about that. It's not, you know, as widespread as other kind of individual ideas, but I think it's very important.
And I think it's undeniable that the way we humans and also other animals experience being a self is partly social. Like the experience of being me is partly refracted through the minds of the social networks that I inhabit. But whether that is where consciousness starts, so for people like Chris Frith, you know, that's why we're conscious in the first place. Like, our brains model our social environments, and only then, as a consequence, come to make a model of the self within the environment. And I think the other way around. I think the fundamental basis of self is in modeling the individual body, and that the social aspect is something that's really, really important. But it is optional in a sort of species-specific way. And the wetware thing, again, is, of course, that's not a human thing. That's every animal. And the reason I use that word is partly just to try and push back against this idea that the brain is a computer and that consciousness is a software program.
Let me just throw one thing. That's where the 12ing thing really comes in handy, because it can allow complex social things for one kind of consciousness, but other animals can have this more lower level noetic consciousness, and still others can have anoetic.
Let's talk about the AI for a second. So I thought it was very interesting that you push back on this sort of canonical idea of AI, which is that we are wetware machines. Therefore, if I make a machine out of a different substrate, as long as it's functionally the same, it will be conscious. And you've really pushed back against that. Can you explain your stance on that?
Yeah, I think it's just a big assumption that nobody knows. And so it comes back to this human exceptionalism thing again in AI. AI is really powerful, really impressive what can be done these days at an ever-accelerating rate. But there is this kind of tendency in some parts of the AI community to think that once AI reaches some threshold of intelligence, you know, often the sort of threshold that's associated with human consciousness, suddenly the lights come on and it's also conscious. There's this sort of slippage between AI and AC that people sometimes think of them as the same. And why is this? I mean, intelligence and consciousness... Artificial consciousness. Artificial. So people think that there's
artificial intelligence, AI, and artificial consciousness.
Yeah, so there's this idea, and we see it in science fiction as well, that like, with HAL from 2001, things like that, a certain amount of intelligence, and then you get consciousness. And I think this is just a very human bias. Again, we think we're smart, we're not that smart, and we know we're conscious, so the two go together. But you don't have to be smart to feel pain or feel fear. These are fundamental emotional experiences that don't require high levels of intelligence. Intelligence and consciousness, at least I think, are very different things. And also, there's this just really powerful metaphor of the brain as being some kind of computer. And so, if the consciousness just depends on exactly on what it does, the program it runs, how it transforms inputs into outputs. But in a computer, you've got a very sharp distinction between the software and the hardware. In the brain, you don't. Between mindware and wetware, where do you draw the line? There isn't really a sharp distinction. And I think both of us, in different ways, come to think of the body as really fundamental to all of our experience. And if that's the case, it's certainly not clear to me that consciousness is the kind of thing that you can implement in a machine as we know them now, in a silicon machine, or that you could upload to the cloud and live forever in the metaverse, if you want to live forever in the metaverse. I don't. So yeah, I just push back. I'm not saying it's impossible. I just think the assumption that AI, as we know it now, can be conscious is driven much more by sort of some techno-rapture broness than actual biology.
Joe, what's your angle on this?
No, I have the same kind of basic summary, I would say. But for me, and I think it's kind of what you're saying, that you'd have to recreate all of the biological accidents that go through the 4 billion year history of life to ultimately get to what is human consciousness now. And that is probably impossible to like recreate that entire simulation of life.
I want to take a second to go to animal consciousness. I don't think I really have time for the amoeba, poor amoeba. Let's go straight to the octopus. Oh, yeah. And Neil, you've talked about the octopus as seeing with its skin. Can you explain to us what that means? Because it has a very decentralized.
Well, there's so many things about
system.
the octopus that whether or not we like say yes it is or it isn't conscious, it's an independent evolutionary experiment in the creation of mind, and it makes us realize that our human minds are just one region in a vast space of possible minds, because it's different in so many ways. The octopus, yes, it's got about 500 million neurons, about the same number of neurons as a mouse, I think. I may be misremembering, something like that. But most of them are in its arms and legs.
So do
than in the
its
central
arms
brain.
think?
Well, they have a level of autonomy that is very, very different from us. You know, if you choose to cut my arm off, it is not going to do very much by itself. But if you do the same to an octopus...
I hope it does nothing, frankly, Neil.
Yeah.
That would be really weird.
If you do the same, and don't do this to an octopus just, you know, for the sake of it, but if you were to do this, an independent octopus arm can still generate a lot of autonomous, quite complex behavior. It's a bit of a stretch to say it has a mind of its own, but it certainly has a sort of decentralized control. So one of the things that I find absolutely fascinating is indeed it can see with its skin, so it's got sort of taste with its skin, and it's got
But it can't see with its eyes.
Well, no,
Color.
it can see with its eyes too, but not
color.
So octopuses have this amazing ability to camouflage.
Even though it can't see it itself.
Even though it can't see what it should need to see with its eyes in order to camouflage. It's a bit weird, but it's...
But it can see it with its skin.
It's as if its skin knows what a predator would see, and therefore matches so that the predator can't see it. And its eyes don't pick up that sort of information. So that's happening through the skin. It can taste through the skin. And I've forgotten the other. I mean, it's got 3 hearts and blue blood. There are an enormous number of things that make it really fascinating.
Now, Joe, you talk a lot about our connection evolutionarily and how a lot of our functions are unconscious. Would you describe what Neil just detailed as unconscious or non-conscious to separate it from the Freudian?
To talk about consciousness in octopuses, I guess we're saying, is kind of like the problem of AI, where you have some very intelligent behavior, but does that cross over to the threshold into consciousness? Because, you know, again, consciousness is a big word, and like taking what's going on in our head and projecting it back, and I'm not sure that's appropriate.
But at least in the case of octopuses, we know they're made out of the same stuff.
Right.
So a whole big unknown goes away, whether the stuff matters. It's the same stuff, so we can take that out of the equation.
Right.
And Joe, are you of the opinion that animals are conscious or can be conscious, or just human beings?
Well, I used to be very kind of, you know, hard on this topic because I couldn't see a way to understand it, but lately I've been using this Tulving partition to allow human consciousness to be distinct from non-human primate consciousness, to be distinct from mammalian consciousness, and I can sort of reverse engineer brain systems involved in various aspects of human consciousness onto these other animals, depending on what kinds of brain they have related to ours. So I'm very comfortable in kind of extrapolating back through mammals, and maybe even into vertebrates, because we can trace our brain's connectivity all the way through those animals. But when we leave the vertebrates, I think it gets very complicated, because at least for my comfort level, I don't see a path for tracing the neural systems that back that far.
I have a last question before we open it up to the audience, and it's about projecting your trust in your own hypotheses, your own understanding onto other planets or a very far future. This is an exoplanet. It's a planet in another star system. We have to search for life there. I think the question is kind of twofold. I'll start with Joe and then go to Anil. we believe life is going to emerge on these planets. Do you think, first off, is consciousness going to be prevalent in the universe, or is it a fluke? And second, is it going to be as far out there as the octopus, or more like us? Like, what is the wildest sort of manifestation of consciousness you can imagine?
All right, you're going to start with some, microbe that we call life.
As we did.
If that's what life is, then you have to have a living, biological, self-sustaining system that is going to reproduce itself and give rise to the whole history of life through lots and lots of accidents, biological accidents that lead to divergence of organisms. So who knows what you're going to end up with? Just because it's alive doesn't mean it's going to end up with what we are.
And Neil?
I think there's something really sort of deeply challenging about this. I mean, we tend to take our conscious existence for granted because we're familiar with it. We're conscious creatures, but it's such a precarious and fragile phenomenon. Even for us, a little of anesthetic, it goes away. A little damage to the brainstem, it goes away. It may not be the outcome of all evolutionary experiments out there in the universe, and certainly, before life had a chance to evolve. It's just to me, it's kind of incredible to imagine there was this universe unfolding with no experiencing happening at all. And even now, people argue a lot about whether life is out there, and I'm pretty sure life is probably out there. But the really important question for me is: are there conscious organisms out there? And for me, that's a very much more difficult question, and it's correspondingly more likely that we might be the only island of awareness in the universe. I hope that's not the case, but it might well be. To really answer that, we need to know so much more than we do already about what the minimal mechanisms are for consciousness, so we can generalize beyond the human and beyond our own particular evolutionary trajectory, and we don't have that yet.
Yeah, but it's kind of like our self-love of consciousness. It requires that we project it all over the place, and maybe it's just a really trivial thing.
Or maybe we're not that successful. I mean, human beings, and Joe, you've said this, we don't go back that deep. It's kind of a shallow history of human consciousness. And it's not clear that we're going to be that successful a species.
We're not very successful, that's for sure.
And on that note, please join me in thanking our guests before we open it up to Q&A. David, do you have anything provocative you want to say? David Chalmers is an expert in consciousness and has spoken with us here at Pioneerix before. Do you want to say anything to your friends here on stage? I'll hand you my mic.
Oh, sure.
Come on over. Come on over, man.
Hey, this one?
They're going to vibrate. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, just a little point. I thought you were very mean to Rene Descartes.
Yeah.
Didn't actually require thinking for existence in the way that many people often understood him to say. He did say cogito ergo sum, which often gets translated as I think, therefore I am. But it turns out, and I only found this out relatively recently, that for Descartes, cogito did not just mean thinking. He included by cogito the conscious experience of seeing, the conscious experience of feeling, as well as the conscious experience of thinking and reasoning. So it actually turns out that in our lingo, the best translation of cogito ergo sum is I am conscious, therefore I am. Which is actually, I think, much less...
Okay, yeah, no, then I'm much happier. Yeah. I'm much happier with him on that reading.
And also Cartesian.
Yeah, newborn.
Thank you, David Chalmers. Please, if you have a question, come line up. Don't be scared. We're very scary, but please come on over. And just to say, David Chalmers is well known for many things, but also for what was called the hard problem of consciousness. And maybe you could both just do a quick one-liner on what the hard problem is.
I think David should tell us.
He's seated. He's a guest again.
I'm going to paraphrase. I'm going to embarrass myself by paraphrasing Dave while he's there. So the hard problem of consciousness really sort of set the scene for modern consciousness science in a way that people still argue about. But it really captures the intuition that you could understand everything about the brain and the body as a physical mechanism, but that still wouldn't explain why there is something it is like to be that mechanism, why any experiencing happening. I think you say something like, it seems objectively unreasonable that physical processing should give rise to an inner life at all, and yet it does. And that's the hard problem. How and why should that physical processing give rise to conscious experience?
But you've also talked about the real problem.
Yeah, that's mainly to have a dig at, a little friendly dig at Dave. Because you can try to answer that question head on and say, okay, so what is it that creates that experience, or that makes certain mechanisms identical to our experience? And we might find the answer, and that would be great. We now solve consciousness, but we might not get there by attacking the hard problem head on. So what I, with sort of tongue-in-cheek, call the real problem is saying, okay, consciousness exists, but as we've discussed, it has many different aspects, manifestations, self, level, sleep and anesthesia and wakefulness, content, the nature of visual experience. And if you can explain, predict and control these different aspects of experience, like why is vision the way it is, different from emotion, different from will, free will, then the hard problem of consciousness might not get solved, but it might get dissolved and vanish in a little puff of metaphysical smoke.
I sense this will be taken up over drinks. Joe, you were going to say something?
I can't do any better than that. So
Awesome. Please, guest, question.
Actually, thank you. It was fascinating to hear you tonight. I'm a fan of all of you and also David Chalmers. So it was so exciting for me to hear David get up and talk about how you kind of gypped Descartes. And I would like to take that even further, because I think it's not just I'm thinking, therefore I am, or I'm seeing, or sensing. But I think what Descartes was saying is, what can I know is true? I can't know that anything is true. I can't know if that table is true. I can't know if anything that I'm seeing outside of what I'm perceiving is true. And in fact, there's really no way for me ever to prove it's true. However, I'm sitting here doubting the fact that these things are true. So I'm doubting the truth of existence. So instead, it should not be I think, therefore I am, but I doubt, therefore I am.
So I'm getting a reputation as a Descartes basher here, which
you give one innocent talk
I just
in Brooklyn,
like one throwaway comment about Descartes, and look what happens. But what you said actually makes me wonder about what Dave said now, because you know, and you're absolutely right that you know, Descartes was talking about how is it possible to believe in how to know what is true, and that requires this sort of doubt, this higher level belief about a belief. You know, can I if I believe X, and then can I doubt that X is the case? That seems to not, to me, apply to seeing or feeling. It seems to be very tied up with thinking. So in that sense, I'm wondering how to square these two different sort of Descartes defenses that are trying to put me in a corner. By the way, I know that Descartes also had a pet dog. So he was, you know, he's often said to, like, okay, animals aren't conscious, but he had a pet dog that he called Mr. Scratch, or Monsieur Grat in French. So in his personal life, he was very nice to animals, or some animals.
Thank you so much for your question. Next, please. I love this line. I'm not sure we'll be able to do all of them, but please.
Hi. You guys spoke a lot about the language we use when talking about our experience as self and the problems there. And a lot of animals can communicate. Bees can communicate, snails and whatever. But how much? I think it's arguable that humans are the only animals that actually have language and use language. Maybe Neanderthal did, or earlier species. How much do you think that language is connected to or correlates with consciousness and experience itself?
Well,
Joe?
you know, I think it's not required, but it certainly changes things. You know, the arrival of language allows you to take a single word and refer to an entire body of knowledge. And so it allows us to partition our lives into little pieces the way that no other animal can without some kind of code, similar code. That's my take.
I think it's particularly true for emotions as well, isn't it? I mean, I think there's this clear thing where you think you're feeling something, but until you can put a name to it, you don't know what that emotion doesn't have a definite character. And different languages. I was in, I wasn't in Portugal, but I was in Romania, and there were a bunch of Brazilians there talking about saudade, or saudade. I don't know how to pronounce it in Portuguese. You would know, Dave. I think. How do you pronounce it? Saudade. Saudade, which is this sort of feeling of longing, bittersweet longingness that yeah, it takes two words to imperfectly translate into English, but it picks out a very definite emotion. So yeah, language gives us the capacity to have many more experiences than we would otherwise have, but I don't think it's necessary for consciousness itself.
So if we are just a product of our genes and these biological accidents and our environment, do we have free will?
Free will. Of course, at last. It has to happen.
That's more of a philosophical problem.
But I think we do. I think, of course, it depends on what you mean by free will. I think there's a sense of free will, which is this idea that there's this immaterial essence of you or me that comes in and changes the course of physical events to make something happen that wouldn't otherwise happen. That I don't think exists. But I don't think we need that sense of free will either. You know, we're complex creatures. We can control, we can do many things. And some of the things that we do because of things that happened to us in the past. Like, you know, I can choose to pick up a glass of water and tip it over Joe, which I'm not going to do because apparently that happened in a previous...
did that to David Chalmers at one of our conversations.
A previous event. But there are things that I do that have more internal causes than external causes. And certainly the way I see it, which is one among many views, is that what we experience as free will is the perception of the body doing things that have more internal causes than immediate external causes. And it's a very, very useful thing to be able to perceive for an organism, because we can learn what happened. Did it go right or did it go wrong? Do something different the next time. So the experience of free will has this weird thing where it feels like the experience causes the action. But in fact, I don't think that's right at all. I think the experience labels the action so that we can learn in a particular way that's useful for the organism.
You know, Joe, I want to let you respond to that organically, but you also talked about this with fear and the amygdala, that the amygdala is like a kind of a gatekeeper, but the conscious mind can't go the other way. You can't consciously choose to not be anxious if the amygdala is triggering that kind of fear.
That was Ledoux 1996 in the emotional brain.
Oh, have you updated since then? Oh my God, I'm so 1996.
I hope every book has been a little bit of an update.
So update that for us.
Well, let me answer her question about free will. I mean, I think free will is, going back to the split brain patients, is this narrative that is part of our narrative, our conscious narrative that allows us to understand who we are. And we have this strong sense, because how could we live without this ability to make choices? And I think that's really core to who we are, is this ability to, generate these ideas that allow us to feel like we belong.
Now, if we could go in the reverse direction, could we choose to not be anxious? Could we choose to edit our DNA? Could we choose, like, is there a future consciousness that is so far progressed that the door goes both ways a little more efficiently?
I think you can have a lot of, unconscious control of cognitive unconscious control over the amygdala and other body systems. Maybe not perfect, but it's certainly, that's why people go to therapy, to try and, get those systems to all work together in ways that we can't consciously just generate. So, like I said, I changed my views a bit.
I love that. See, this is why I always say scientific controversies is not a debate, because scientists have to change their views if they're being scientific. right? We have to be open to each other's opinions. So I have the prerogative of the last question, and I was thinking that you opened Being You, your book, with a quote by Emily Dickinson. I'm going to see if I can get it right. The brain is bigger than the sky.
Wider.
Wider.
I'm going to check. I'm going to check
you
while you read it.
You do it, Joe. You do it.
I wrote a song about it.
Oh, did you? Can you do the quote?
Different quote.
The brain is wider than the sky, for, put side by side, the one the other contains with ease, and you beside. Why did you open the book with that quote? And I'm going somewhere with this, besides just the quote.
Well, I think it's a beautiful piece of poetry, and it's a beautiful expression of what I think a neuroscientific understanding of consciousness can deliver. It shows a sort of, it encourages a sort of respect and awe for the brain, and it tells us that everything that we experience, that the world that we experience, is part of us. It's part of the experience of being a person too. And it puts it in a beautifully lyrical way. And
you wrote a song about it.
It's not a song that ever got published, but I did another one called Fearing that was based on one of her poems that is out there on the internet.
So the question that I was leading into is that people are rarely terrified about the concept that their consciousness ceased to exist in the past, but they're terrified about the prospect of it ceasing to exist in the future. Do you have any words of wisdom on that? Why do I feel like you're going to say no?
Well, I mean, you know, if consciousness is a physical thing, part of the reality that we live in, then it probably is not going to make it across the other side. I was once invited to a conference in Krakow, Poland, organized by Protestant theologians that were also physicists. And they wanted to find a way for the soul to survive death. And their only solution that they could come up with was to scratch normal physics and create a new physics that would allow that to be true.
I'm not even commenting.
It was sponsored by the Vatican.
I love it.
I think you put it perfectly in the way you put the question, that we don't tend to worry about all the time we weren't conscious before we're born, but we are. Many of us, we worry and we just miss this future where we're not going to exist. We have this irrational asymmetry towards it. And I also opened the book with a story of going under general anesthesia, which I found absolutely fascinating. I highly recommend it to everybody. And because it's so different from going to sleep. You know, you are not there. It's oblivion. You do not exist. You could be gone for 5 minutes or 5 years. You would not know in deep anesthesia. It's the closest you can come to death without actually dying. I think, forget, near-death experience is another thing. And of course, nothing happens. And that's not so bad. So there's as well as Emily Dickinson, there's a novel I love by Julian Barnes, with the title Nothing to be Frightened of, and it's a meditation on mortality. And I think I love it because nothing to be frightened of, he means it in both ways. We're terrified of oblivion, but then there's nothing to be frightened of.
Beautiful. What a pleasure speaking to both of you. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.